Hello, my friend, and welcome to another episode of The Follow-Up Question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. I've got a question for you as we begin this episode. What group do you most identify with? Welcome to The Follow-Up Question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. When my family and I moved from Kansas to Colorado back in 2015, it was a culture shock. Despite the fact that Kansas and Colorado actually share a border, the two states seemed worlds apart. And I'm not talking about geography here. Obviously, my home state of Kansas is known for its wide open spaces and prairies, and Colorado, of course, has the Rocky Mountains. And I will say, it was somewhat strange moving from quote-unquote flyover country to a visitor and tourist destination sought out by people from around the world. But that wasn't it. That wasn't what felt strange. And I'm not talking about politics. Sure, there are some noticeable differences between the conservative stronghold that is Kansas and the largely liberal base that Colorado has become in recent decades. But no, that wasn't it either. It was something deeper. And it actually took my wife and I years to articulate it, but I think it can be now best described in two words: staunch individualism. Perhaps it is the old westward expansion ethos still coursing through the high mountain air, that rugged frontiersman attitude that told those fortune seekers that they alone were in charge of their destiny. My wife and I feel it in the ways people go about their lives here in Colorado. There's a bent towards never needing to rely on someone else for anything. Your problems are your own to deal with. Interactions with others are kind enough, but few will go out of their way to start an interaction with someone new. And coming from the Midwest, it was a startling deviation from what my wife and I were used to. But then again, I guess if you look closely enough, this attitude existed in Kansas as well. It just sounded a little different. You might have even heard it or said it yourself. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. The translation being, if you've got problems, well, then you're the one to fix them. I'm not saying either one is bad or wrong, they just are. And in fact, it seems to be, if I may be so bold, the American way. It's not just for the Midwest, and it's not just for the West. American individualism is everywhere. It's in our media, in our stories, in our heroes. It strikes me as quite ironic that we're a collection of people dedicated to the idea of individual and individual freedoms, which kind of means we're conforming, aren't we? I don't know. But hold on. Is it the American way? Or what if it's more? What if it's what we've become as humans? You see, we live in a world where the individual is celebrated and held up as the first and last option, and reliance on others is often shamed and degraded in many ways. Yet this notion, this way of going about life, it goes against who we are and who we were made to be because we're tribal. We work best in small groups, sharing resources and working together to solve problems. Tribalism is hardwired in our DNA. For so much of humanity's recorded history, this has been true, and it has helped us achieve some remarkable things, despite the fact that these days, tribalism often is used as a four-letter word. And that's because the question is out there: what happens when this tribe drive goes haywire? When it subconsciously consumes your ability to critically think? When unconscious devotion to the tribe, and however you define it and identify with it, causes you to see those outside the tribe as threats, enemies, and others. My guest, David Samson, believes that our bent towards tribalism, yes, has its negative consequences, but they can be overcome. And tribalism and understanding the ways we work together as humans can actually be a good thing if we pay attention to it. David is an associate professor of biological anthropology at the University of Toronto and the author of the book, Our Tribal Future: How to Channel Our Foundational Human Instincts into a Force for Good. As you'll hear from David, and as he writes in his book, no one is immune from the biases, notions, and tribal bents that govern your worldview, and by extension, how you aim to solve problems. Accepting this and then critically examining how this has shaped your perception of reality, that can be an unlock to communicating across differences and divides and to actually solving real challenges and issues. You wrote in the book that on a daily basis that you take note and register tribalism's influence on yourself and on others. And I got to ask, really? A daily basis, David? Is that true?
It's so true that it's almost unconscious at this point. But I guess first it has to be raised to the level of consciousness before you can do it. It's almost like reading body language, right? For those who have any expertise or experience or life experience with learning body language, it's fascinating because 60% of it is under the hood. We don't know that we're doing it until we get a formal education in it. And then all of a sudden you see it everywhere until it becomes muscle memory. And then once it's muscle memory, it's just part of the way you update your Bayesian framework, your model of how the world works, how people work. All that becomes integrated, and you can play from there.
Which is not unlike a tribe drive, right? Am I
Hmm.
understanding the work that you do correctly? That it is so ingrained within us that we don't understand it until we bring consciousness to it?
Well, yeah. So actually, to that point, a recent study just came out from Oberst and Imhoff. They're psychologists. This is a 2023 study, and they found that of the 150 so documented human biases, those the ways in which our perception can be alterated in our environment, of those 150, they can actually be boiled down to about six fundamental beliefs or biases about the world. So this is the list right here.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
Yeah, I am good. My group is good. I make correct assessments of the world. My experience is a reasonable reference, and my group is a reasonable reference, meaning that our experience is generalizable. All people, individuals, and groups also can use these as references. And the last one, which is pretty on point for our topic today of tribalism, is that people's attributes, not the context by which they choose, shape outcomes. So it's literally to the point where every idea that you and I are going to discuss today now will, in large part, be accepted or denied based on our pre existing identity and its associated beliefs. It's that fundamental.
Explain that a little bit more. So it
Yeah.
that last one in particular, that we
Hmm.
we explain that. Just what is that? What are the ramifications of that?
Yeah, so our identities, right? The ways in which our identity is associated with our worldview, the things that are correlated with it. If you are to say something that confirms my something positive about my identity, I will, without question, accept it. If it counters my identity, my brain will immediately build up almost like an immunological response to figure out ways to poke and counter it. And this is definitely connected to our identity protective cognition. This is fundamental. This is actually what the Oberst and Imhoff studies really getting at, is this concept of identity protective cognition. If something threatens our identity, we're going to figure out ways to dismantle it. And if it supports it, we're going to advertise it and project it as much as possible. And it maybe at this point, it's actually worthwhile to talk a little bit about the evolutionary narrative around this, because it's really to understand how this trait came into being. You have to understand the deep time and the deep perspective that we're talking about from an evolutionary framework. So the analogy I've been using here is that of the human movie. So imagine we're boiling down 1.8 million years of human evolution into a digestible movie. Your average movie is 100 minutes, right? Something really interesting happens within the first minute. Within the first minute, we descend from the trees, our Australopithecine ancestors, which are basically chimpanzees from the waist up and humans from the waist down. These proto-human-like animals start dwelling on the Gallery savannas. And within 1 minute, to adapt to this novel environment, we start doing something pretty innovative. We start living and dwelling in camps. So we still have populations on planet Earth that exhibit this particular camp dwelling strategy. They're called hunter-gatherers or foragers.
Mm-hmm.
And so a camp is basically 20 to 30 adults in the shared project of survival. They'll forage in their environment and they'll bring back those resources in what's called central place provisioning. They'll share those resources amongst people in the camp, right? And so this was a radical departure from the kinds of social societies we had before. And this happens in the first minute of the human movie. And basically you would need a David Attenborough at this point to spice up the rest of the movie, because it's going to be very much like a documentary at this point until minute 84. And at minute 84 is around 300,000 years ago in the human narrative. And at minute 84, we create one of the greatest advancements in power projection strategy in the history of all life on the planet. That's when the tribe drive really takes hold. And the reason why we know it happens right around this time is because you can start to see human beings trading beyond the 30-kilometer home range average of your typical hunter-gatherer. And they start embedding in the materials that they're trading. They're starting to embed signatures of us that can be distinguished from them.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll start to see places like Arlagasali, Kenya. You'll see these bits of rock that have ochre signatures on them that were clearly not from the location in which they ended up at the end. So right around 300,000 years ago, you have this tribe drive take root. And at this part in the movie, it starts getting a little bit more interesting, because you start getting a shift in our, basically the makeup of our morality. So with the camp level, you have the blessing and the curse. The blessing is that you have this incredible capacity to share amongst the camp members in your group. But you also have to adhere to those social norms of the group. Otherwise, you can get canceled and excommunicated, get kicked out of the group.
Right.
So that's the blessing and curse of camp life.
Yeah.
Now, something really remarkable happens once the tribe drive evolves. You have the capacity, and I think at this point, it's actually worthwhile defining what a tribe is. It's an intersubjective belief network that is designed to signal coalitionary alliance, saying basically, I'm a part of this team. And the function is to bootstrap trust amongst strangers. And this is radical. No other animal on the planet has this. In fact, if you look at chimpanzees, our closest sister species that we share a common ancestor going back 6 million years, they hate strangers. They hate all strangers. If you try and introduce a stranger from a different group, chimp to another group, a home group, they will kill it. They'll kill it. And so humans are bizarre in that we actually love strangers, only we love certain strangers. We love strangers that signal the same abstract symbolic stuff to us, right? And so it happens at this moment 300,000 years ago, 84 minutes into the movie, where all of a sudden you can encounter somebody that, say, signals the same coalitionary team. Like perhaps maybe your tribe uses a particular feather in their headdress, or they ablate their teeth, or they lengthen the skull shape. And these are all examples from the archaeological record. And so at this point, something also happens to our morality. We gain the capacity to cooperate among strangers, but the curse to this blessing is that we can also dehumanize, because if you're not signaling the right cues, then you're considered outgroup. And we have a lot of neurobiological mechanisms that can figure out ways to turn outgroup into less than human. And so you have the precursors to kind of the worst types of moral behavior that humans can have. And so that happens at minute 84, and it starts slowly bootstrapping through time until 1 minute left in the human movie. It gets absolutely crazy. It starts turning into a science fiction film. So with 1 minute left in the movie, you've got humans becoming the sole inheritors of the earth. We're outcompeting every other hominid on the planet. In fact, Neanderthals, the last hominins, are outcompeted. And the reason I believe that they were outcompeted is they didn't have the tribe drive. They didn't have the symbolic capacity at the level and the scale that Homo sapiens had. And so I really think it's one of the reasons why we're the sole inheritors of the earth. We're the last hominins with this capacity. With 30 seconds left in the movie, we start living in sedentary lifestyles. We start congregating in bigger and bigger scales in smaller and smaller geographies. And so with 15 seconds left to compensate for this, one of the most important, I would say from our vantage point, important tribal signaling capacities we have, which is religion. The big gods are invented. The big gods are created. And you can literally see it's at every population on the planet that scales beyond a few million people. That's where the monotheistic big scale religions start to pop up. And it's literally to basically by pen or by sword say, we've got to cooperate in this really small environment. Let's all believe the same intersubjective stuff, right? And so that's 15 seconds left. With a second left in the movie, you can start to see why we are thrown into the state of mismatch and disarray that we're in today. So remember with 1 minute in the movie, we first evolved camps. And with 1 minute left in the movie, we depart from camps radically. In fact, one of the things we do in North America, we create the suburb, right? We create Levittown in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. We create basically the McDonald's social pattern of the 20th and 21st century. And at the same time, with milliseconds left in the movie, we take 5 billion people, give them cell phones, and where our ancestors maybe only had to contend with 1 or 2 tribes at a time, we then upload all the tribes into the world onto social media. And we wonder why we're in the state of confusion and disarray that we're in now. It brings to bear this quote from Carl Sagan and Andrian: Moths are unprepared for a world with windows. And so I think we've set up a lot of windows in our environment, Michael, and that might help explain a little bit of what's going on.
David, there's so much there that you just explained. I guess I want to take it back to tribe and tribalism, mm-hmm. or tribe drive, or however you want to word it. Why is it seemingly, at least to this one person, why is it seemingly so often ascribed a negative connotation to be involved in a tribe, or to be tribalistic, or to be of a tribe? Why is that?
Yeah.
Why is that out there, that it's some sort of negative?
Yeah, let's make a distinction here between a tribe, which I defined, and tribalism.
Okay.
So tribalism, I'm going to go ahead and bin with all the other isms out there, which we kind of like, we kind of are, our species is wrestling with a lot of isms. But tribalism is essentially the idea, I think the mistaken idea, that our coalition is somehow inherently superior to other coalitions or teams.
Uh-huh.
I think you can even take racism and put that under as a subcategory of what the one of the bad offshoots of tribalism actually
Sure.
is.
Sure.
So I think framing it that way actually gives us a much better pulse on what's going on, because the science shows that we're not born racist, but we are born coalitionists. And so that's the target. If we're going to fix racism, we really need to figure out the part of our mind that is adapted to this particular tribe drive so that we can understand it better and help improve the way we interact with other coalitions.
So then this mismatch that you speak of,
Yeah.
let's fully outline what that looks like. What are the ramifications of
Beautiful.
what that looks like for us today? How does that manifest itself in our lives when we're in this
Yeah.
state of mismatch?
Yeah. So I think that's maybe one of the most important questions you can ask, Michael, because before I understood evolutionary mismatch, I was missing a key ingredient of understanding from an evolutionary perspective where the major sources of human suffering derive from. So it's not just human. It's every animal on the planet can be in a state of mismatch. So let me flesh out an example
Sure.
of mismatch outside of humans, and then we'll jump back to
Okay.
humans. So a really clear, clean example is that of the South African jewel beetle. So this beetle it's got a beautiful shell on its outer casing on its wings, and the divots in these shells are rather large for a beetle. And it turns out the males are particularly attracted to females with really, really big, sexy divots. Okay. And so what happened is, and this is actually from a recent publication, what happened was beer companies in South Africa were creating divoted beer bottles with the same color and the same texture as these wings, and the males were opportunistically mating with the beer bottles as over females. Okay, and so the population of the South African jewel beetle was plummeting. But the good news is, Michael, is that with an intervention, you can actually change the mismatch for the better. So they started removing these bottles, and all of a sudden, you saw a rebound in the population of the South African jewel beetle. So if we take this to modern humans, for example, this is essentially a state where we evolved for how things were, not how things are. Okay. We can take diet, for example. Our Paleolithic ancestors evolved in environments where sugars, fats, and oils were incredibly rare. And when they did get them, they usually went through some incredible ordeal to be able to get them. The first thing that comes to mind, having worked with the Hadza hunter gatherers out in Tanzania, is honey. It's one of their highest ranked foods is honey, and they will literally stick their hand in a live bee nest to get it, to get clumps of it to bring back, eat, consume, and share with their camp, right? But now we're in an environment where all we have to do is walk, like, or order on Uber
Right.
Eats, right?
You don't have to leave the house.
You don't even have to leave the house, and you can just order whatever your heart desires, and it's likely, if your heart desires it, it's likely going to be high in sugars, fats, and oils. So this has created a state of mismatch. You have the consequences are disastrous. You have obesity epidemics, you have heart disease as an epidemic, and a host of other non-communicable diseases. We call them diseases of affluence.
Yes.
I just think of them as mismatch, right?
Mm.
So now let's think about mismatch from the perspective of social mismatch and what this means for humans. So this is fascinating and so timely. I think it was only a couple months ago that the Surgeon General created an advisory. This was popularized in the news as well, because I think it was so unusual for a Surgeon General to actually have an advisory trying to elevate to people's attentions, particularly Americans' attention, that social isolation is deadly.
Mm.
And I think this was one of the best things he could possibly do, because what we're seeing is that, particularly for social species, isolation is really dangerous. So even look at rats, for example. In social isolation, they'll have 84 times the tumors that a rat will have just embedded in a social network. If you look at it from the perspective of adolescence, over 40% of college students report being too depressed to function most days. 50% are saying they regularly feel hopeless most of the time. 2/3 are overwhelmingly and significantly more anxious than cohorts measured in previous studies. And kind of really sadly is 10% of college students today have seriously considered suicide. And these rates have been recorded in the past 20 years, but they've doubled since 2009 and 2010. So this is an ongoing issue that has major consequences, to the point where sometimes I ask myself, you see on the news another school shooting. And one of the things I always think of when I see this is, what if you took that kid who's now either committed suicide after, opening fire on his peers? What if you took that kid and they grew up in a hunter-gatherer camp? Would that kid be as socially damaged as he was in our society?
Mm-hmm.
And I just the end of that thought experiment is likely no. Likely they had some sort of inherent value that was embedded in the fact that they were a functioning member of a camp. Now that's just totally speculation, but I often think about that when I come across those bits in the news. Now for adolescents, it's very disconcerting, but isolation is deadly for adults. It's predictive of increased broad-based morbidity, mortality, predicts antisocial behavior, makes it harder for your adult brain to grow, so it reduces neuroplasticity. Adults who are isolated have increased baseline stress, predicts drug use and suicide. For men, it's really predictive of weaker immune systems and heart disease. For women, postpartum depression
Mm-hmm.
is likely to occur if they're in loneliness. So this is so much to say that Sarah Rose Kavanaugh said loneliness is tied to being more likely to die at any time of any cause in any phase of life. And so what I think is going on here is that we're in a state, as I said, of social mismatch, right? Our ancestors, for 99.9 minutes of the movie, of the human narrative, were in these highly embedded social camps. The networks were strong. And at no instance were you ever expected to survive on your own. This is so much to say that the nuclear family, as we call it, is really just sort of a 20th century invention. I would say the basic fundamental social unit is the nuclear camp. And so now we evolved for the nuclear camp, but we're not dwelling in nuclear camps. And so we're having negative consequences on in terms of our health, wellness, and well-being with respect to how we orient ourselves socially. So that's one really crucial component of the mismatch.
So the old saying, it takes a village when talking about raising a child isn't really happening right now. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's a really nice and elegant way of putting it, Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things you wrote that I highlighted in the book kind of flows into this, which is these days the value of the small group has been almost eclipsed either by a focus on the individual or on vast groups at a national or even global scale. We are in effect in a state of evolutionary mismatch. So you talked about the mismatch there. Dive into that. What it seems easy to blame social media, David, but is that boiling it down to too simplistic of a reason why we are either so, especially here in the United States, it's so about individual and individual freedom and doing my thing and don't tread on me and all those things. Or we have, as you said, access to every tribe on the planet now through, this, and I'm holding up my phone for the people listening. Is that too simplistic? Am I boiling it down to just make things easy on myself?
Yeah. So the way I think about this now is I tend to think about this in terms of operationalizing human scale in an optimal way. So let me rephrase
Yeah, please,
that.
please.
Yeah. So are you familiar at all with Dunbar's work about human group size and the like?
It's in the 50s, right? It's in the mid 50s.
So Robin Dunbar, he's actually still continuing his work. A lot of the Dunbar's number is one that comes up a lot, and it's something I talk a little bit about in the book as well. So Dunbar's number is basically it's the value of 150.
150. I was
And
off by 100.
yeah. Well, the thing is, you actually weren't off. There are different scales,
Okay.
depending on what you're trying to do. So you're totally
Okay.
right. There's just the classic Dunbarian number is 150. This is the number. It's basically what we call a channel capacity. It's the limitation of our minds to process a certain top end of the number of social relationships we can actually understand.
Mm-hmm.
So the way Dunbar says this is it's the number of people that you would see at a bar and not feel awkward just striking up and continue a conversation with.
Okay.
Right. And so these things actually map on really nicely to our understanding of evolutionary theory and like of the scale and size of how human groups change through time. So the very first number is 5. 5 is about the number of individuals that the average human has very, very deep, trusting relationships with. The U.S. military actually uses this number, this value, for fire teams. So it's one of the most effective unit sizes for acute missions where everybody has to trust each other, and you get that with these small numbers. Incidentally, it's going to be the number. It's going to also match up very cleanly with people's typical responses for the number of people they could go to in an emergency. So there's these things that you start seeing these values pop up time and time again in different ways. 15 is the platoon size. It's basically, 15 to 30 adults that you're trusting on the camp level. And then 150, incidentally, is the human band size. So in forager societies, you have 3 or 4 camps that are then consolidated geospatially into a band. And this is kind of like your incest hedge. So, you don't have like too much interbreeding within one camp.
Mm-hmm.
People will go seek mates in different camps in this band structure. But everybody knows each other. And so this is why that value of 150 is super crucial. Because once you get beyond 150, the human mind can't really process any more deep relationships. And so when you see people dwelling in social environments that scale beyond this drastically, that's when you start to get that loss of sense of trust. So when you have at the tribe level, the average tribe size is 1,500 people in small scale societies. So you really don't, if we're thinking about this in the 21st century, one of the ways to do this is to think about group size explicitly. Let me give you a great example. So have you ever heard of the town of Roseto or the Roseto Mystery?
No, I have not.
Okay.
No.
Okay. So this is so cool. I'm kind of obsessed with this anecdote now because it's so telling and so interesting. So Stuart Wolf was a doctor, a medical doctor in the 1950s, and he went to a conference in a town called Roseto in the 1950s. And the claim that the doctors of this town made was that nobody was dying of heart disease, nobody was dying of cancer, everybody was dying of old age. And Stuart was like, "What? That makes no sense." And so he spent the next 10 years of his life measuring the health status of people in the town of Roseto, in this small town of Pennsylvania. And what he found was quite remarkable. It literally, the claim was that most people were dying of old age was actually true. They had almost half the rates of heart disease. And this was an endemic in the 50s. So it's like they were really worried about heart disease at this time. And they were wondering what was going on here. And so he said, well, let's be scientists about this. Is it genes? Is there just something miraculous about the genes of the Rosetans? And so he went and searched other places where Rosetans were. And it turned out it wasn't genes because they were dying of the same things. When they were outside of the town, they were dying of the same things that everybody else was. It wasn't geography because the adjacent towns to Rosetta that were basically identical to any other town in Pennsylvania were also seeing the same stats. And it wasn't diet and exercise because the Rosetans were they were immigrants from Italy, and they didn't have a social norm of exercising. We'll just say that. It was more like smoking and drinking at night, and drinking and eating lots of
Lots
pasta,
of
lots of
pasta.
carbs,
Yeah.
right? Lots of pasta. So it wasn't that either. And then you look at his second thing was to look at the social makeup of the town. And you saw that 70% of the individuals there were co-housing intergenerationally. So you had kids and grandparents in the same house. 80% of them were all Roman Catholic, and they had a beloved shaman in their group. It was a Catholic priest. And he was very involved in over the 25 different, what we would call in anthropology, sodalities. They're basically clubs, social clubs for both men and women that basically were ways in which they could coalesce together over specific projects and things that could help ameliorate the town. And basically, what they discovered was the most important stat, I think, was the town, since they had been measuring the population size, had never gotten bigger than 1,600 people. And it had stayed within 100 people, plus or minus 1,600, from the point in the turn of the 20th century when they started recording the demography of the entire town. And I think what this speaks to is the fact that not only were they all on the same, they all had the same intersubjective belief network. So they were all the same tribe, right? But on the other hand, they were all living in a scale of human interaction that recapitulates the scales of human interaction that we had in terms of sizes of groups for 99 and a half minutes of the human story. And so if there's any message of the book, is that we need to protect the group, those group sizes that enhance human wellness and well-being. We need to pour our energies into those face-to-face sub-tribal groups. That's where our identities, that's where we should put all of our emotional and identity energy into, those face-to-face community groups, and create ways to protect against the worst of what can happen when the tribe drive runs amok and you get intergroup and intertribal conflict when it starts scaling beyond it.
So let's then take it back to what you first mentioned in our conversation here, David, that our sense of identity shapes and molds our reality about ourselves, our opinions about ourselves. And if we're positively affirmed in that identity, we accept it. And if we're negatively affirmed in that identity, or negatively, I don't know, affirmed is not the word, we reject it or find ways to poke holes in it. I guess the question, the follow-up question to that, David, is why does that feel then ultimately so dangerous?
Yeah. The danger is very real. The danger, when we look at this neurophysiologically, there is a beauty to the underlying neurophysiology that allows us to be able to identify and group with others as though they are ourselves. We actually call this the social self, and it's called the anterior cingulate cortex. Say, for example, you're in the kitchen and someone you love and care for is cutting and dicing up some carrots. They cut themselves, and you see it, and you hear them exclaim in pain, and they're bleeding. Literally, the part of your brain that will light up is the anterior cingulate cortex, and it is the thing that makes it to where you feel their pain. You're literally feeling their pain. And here's the crux of it. Identity is at the core of this, because if a stranger did this, the ACC wouldn't light up. So this isn't really, it's not even a moral problem. It's actually an energy problem. It's how do humans know who to invest their energy into? And the way that evolution solved this problem was by literally not distinguishing between yourself and the social other, the social self. So those individuals in your group who you identify with.
Right.
And so the trick is figuring out ways to almost self-diagnose to what extent this is happening in your own life, and even on perhaps the more larger societal scale, the tribal scale. So I have a couple different self-diagnostics that in the final chapter of the book I go through to help measure your own tribalism. So the first one is the mirror game. It's kind of like a moral equivalency test. So if you think of a political rival, right? For example, like somebody on a political team you don't like, and which is not too hard to do in the 21st century.
Right.
Almost everybody has one of those, right?
Right.
So, so if you go through the exercise of thinking them being accused, or there's evidence that they, flubbed their taxes, or they've done something illegal, right? Run through that exercise, see how it makes you feel as a matter of experience, and then put the individual that's part of your team, your political tribe, and then say that they've been accused of the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any difference in that experience of perceiving that, then you likely have there's some sort of tribe bias inherent there. The way they've done this in scientific studies per year in 2022 showed that correcting for basic morality bias, this is the bias that I'm talking about. If you look at the actual breaks in morality from the other team, it's between 1% and 3%. Each team is like 1% and 3%. But the perceived morality of the out group from your in group, you perceive that they break moral social norms 10 to 30%. So it's actually an order of magnitude. We think the other team is so bad that they're an order of magnitude worse morally, when empirically, although depending on what you're talking about, there's like little between conservatives and liberals, there are small but subtle differences in the way they perceive morality, but it's nowhere near the way we perceive their moral differences.
Right.
So that's the mirror game is actually a really powerful way to do that. There's also the moral valence test. So how virulent is my tribalism? So if you, for example, imagine we'll since it's low hanging fruit here and we've already talked about it, imagine the political symbol or the political flag of your out group, right? And if you feel as like, I want you to go into a meditative state now, right? And imagine what, as a matter of like the energy signatures in your body, how does it make you feel? Do you feel any contempt at all? Any sort of like disgust response? Or like when you see a tweet from the out group political party, do you ever say the words, that's disgusting? Now, I catch myself, I'm because I'm a Homo sapien, I catch myself doing this all the time. But as soon as I do, what I can now say is that, oh man, my insular cortex is lighting up. And so what do I mean by that? The insular cortex is a part of the brain that is like 40 million years old in mammals, right? And we share this with so many different species on the planet because it's a very powerful adaptive response. It's an antitoxin response. We all have it. It's basically, when you stick your tongue out and you go, chimpanzees do this, monkeys do this. This is a universal symbol of, that's gross. I want to get it away. I want to expel it.
Mm-hmm.
That makes, from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense, right? You want to expel bad things and you want to be close to good things. So evolution, though, is a thrifty engine. It doesn't create new systems for new problems. It co-ops old ones. And so this insular cortex connected to your amygdala, which is your fear response, as soon as you perceive a social norm violation, the same part of your brain lights up. As though a cockroach were crawling on you and trying to get in your mouth. You're literally like, oh, gross, when you see a perceived social norm violation. And the reason why this is so important to be aware of, Michael, is because when this lights up, it's the precondition that you have to go through as a human to start doing some of our worst behaviors, like genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a cultural universal. Whenever one in-group makes the decision as a group to systematically eliminate another group that identifies not as your group, the program is so ancient. It's 40 million years old ancient. The program is to basically turn that outgroup into less than human or subhuman. And it's like, if you look at Nazi propaganda, it's all the same stuff. It's
Right.
all, our outgroups are insects, they're vermin,
Hmm.
they're disease,
Hmm.
right? That needs to be exterminated. It's a classic response. And so being aware of the virulence of how we react in contempt of the outgroup, that's super important. And I think bringing that to our level of awareness is I think one of the most important things we can do to bring the temperature down in the room.
David, is there a step needed before that?
Mm.
I keep going back to this belief that if you say something good about me, I'm going to accept it. And if you say something bad about me, I'm going to poke holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
There's this perception of what is true, perception of reality around us
Mm-hmm.
that do we have to somehow break that bubble around us that our
Yeah.
and accept or admit that our reality is shaped by a lot of things that we don't even understand or notice, but it is different for different people. I'm
Yeah.
just I guess I'm asking, is there a step that we have to get to mentally before we can actually even do the mirror test and the moral
Yeah.
virulence test?
No, I think that's the $1 million question. And there's actually some really hopeful science that's emerging in the field of cognitive immunology and in mental immunity. This is basically the idea that there is a kind of mental immune system
Mhm.
that can strengthen our resilience against bad or harmful ideas. Let me bring up an example here that I hope addresses your really insightful comment. So Pennycook and colleagues in 2020, they actually came out with this really cool study. It was on this concept called meta belief, on the belief that beliefs can change when evidence suggests that it should. And so when I think of the first steps for us to improve our odds as a species, I think of how do we combat the tribe virus, right? The tribalism virus. And so let me flesh out what I think this could be. So the tribalism virus would be something like willful unreason that is tethered with identity protective cognition. Remember, we talked about this core bias, identity protective cognition. And when you couple it with willful unreason, that's when you get the worst kinds of my sideism or my side bias. A good example of this is in the 2008, 2009s, around that time, there was a creation versus evolution debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Oh yes, I remember this.
And
Yes.
you remember this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Andy Norman and I discussed this on when he was
Oh,
on the
that's
show.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. This is right up Andy's alley,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah. And so Ken Ham, so in response to, I think, the most telling question of the night, which was, what, if anything, would change your mind? Right. And in fact, when you are in any intractable dialogue with somebody that you're discussing with, this is actually one of the most powerful mental immune boosting questions you can have. Is what, if anything, would change your mind? What data could allow you to change your mind? And Bill Nye, classic scientist, he said, well, I would need to see some geological data. I would need to see some astronomical data. I would need to see some data from these several fields indicating that there was an update in the priors that could then help me change my perspective on this. When Ken Ham was pressed, this was literally his response. I'm a Christian. I won't change my mind. So you could see the answer to this question was his identity. And if you hear the crowd, there's like clapping in the crowd. It was like, this is my team. You don't understand. It's not about, so the value proposition here is not about truth. It's about signaling your alliance. It's about signaling your strength of association with this identity, which I have to admit, from an evolutionary standpoint, we didn't evolve for truth. We evolved to survive and reproduce, right? So like we have these fundamental challenges. So going back to the tribalism virus here, this is identity protective cognition coupled with willful unreason. Now, what if we were to create a tribalism vaccine where you're using that active but benign part of the tribalism virus. That's identity protective cognition. But you're using it against the worst parts of in-groupism and my side bias. So if we have here as the adjuvant in this vaccine, an adjuvant is the instruction giving protocol to your immune system afterwards. If you have as the adjuvant meta belief, the belief that beliefs can change, and your group protects this sacred value, that could be a great starting point by which you could protect like the species as a whole. Like we are a meta tribe. This is our sacred value. And I'm not under any illusions that we're going to get 100% of of Homo sapiens to sign on to this identity. But if we even just get herd immunity, 20, 30, 35%, that could go a really long ways in terms of upping the probabilistic likelihood that we survive as a species.
Yeah, Andy and I had that conversation about that, and I am a Christian, so it was a very interesting,
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
discussion, and to think of it more along the lines of, I like how you kind of worded it there, tapping into the benefits or the
Yeah.
positives
Yeah.
of what makes us a tribe. I'm reminded when Dominic Packer was on this show. He and Jay
Mm-hmm.
Van Bevel wrote the book The
The
Power of
power of
Us,
us.
and they describe in that a study where it was the stinky t-shirt study,
Mm-hmm.
where people were primed ahead of time to either think of themselves as an out group, or that person who was wearing the shirt was of a rival institution, or they were primed to think of themselves as part of this more global, we are all college students in
Mm-hmm.
this kind of world
Mm-hmm.
together. And the kids who were primed to think of themselves as the rival institution thought the shirt stank worse. Like, we literally were more disgusted
Yep.
by our out group when we were primed with the things that capitalize on our tribalistic
Yep.
tendencies. I just thought that
Totally.
was such a interesting depiction of kind of everything that you just described there. But
Yeah.
is that part of this then, as we kind of begin to wrap
Mm-hmm.
this up here, David? Is that part of it, is just priming ourselves? Is a primer needed to think of ourselves more as a species of humans, or is that too global thinking?
Yeah. Um, that's a beautiful question. So I guess I actually have just a brief comment on that, and then I have a question for
Of
you.
course.
So yeah, in terms of the response to that idea, I think the answer there is the ultimate primer, the most effective primer should be literally the biology. The biology, Michael, is that we share a common ancestor. Every human being on the planet shares a common ancestor going back 250,000 years to East Africa. And to me, that is magic. That is so unifying. We all want to love and be loved by a strong network. We all want to sacrifice for people we care for. We all want to avoid pain and displeasure. We are all afraid of death and dying. These things are baked into our experience, so much so that 90% of the human experience is almost identical. We just are so obsessed with focusing on that 10% that differs.
Yeah.
So to that point, my question for you, because we actually both share likely a common experience, unless you converted to Christianity. Did you grow up
I
Christian?
grew up Christian. Yes.
Yeah, so did I. My father was a fundamentalist Christian minister for 25
Yes.
years. So I was a PK, I was a preacher's kid. And so just because I don't want it to sound like there's been this fascinating evolution of my own life of I would say rebelling against Christianity early on because of such an authoritarian force it represented in my life.
Mhm.
And then as I wrote this book, one of the things that was so fascinating about it was seeing the raw benefits of being religious in terms of reproductive fitness, wellness, psychological well-being. There were so many studies that were indicating that people with a strong religious identity were experiencing as a day-to-day very fulfilling lives. And so I was wondering, my question for you was, what are the benefits for you as identifying as Christian?
A lot of the things you just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it gives me a layer on top of which to view the human experience, the things that you just outlined. It gives me a sense, and I know that's not necessarily measurable, but a sense
Mm-hmm.
of why pain exists and doesn't in
Mm-hmm.
humans. Why humans have a shared morality,
Mm-hmm.
and why that's important, and why we as Homo sapiens, as humans, even have morals.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it helps me to answer the question of why. One of my favorite lines in one of my favorite Christian songs is by
Mm-hmm.
Hillsong United, and it talks about the world evolving in pursuit of what God said or
Mm-hmm.
says, and that I'm probably not the greatest person to answer this because I
Oh.
question a lot of traditional Christianese a lot these days, and I've
Mm-hmm.
I've just had a recent guest on who I sorted through that. But the role of God in my life has very much evolved over the course of
Mm-hmm.
my life, and it gives me this framework of understanding the pull that is unmeasurable within the human being, within the human experience. This pursuit of, why do we share these values, share these morals? How does it go poorly? What is that thing, that imperceptible thing that connects us as human beings?
Yeah.
That is often, at some, in many ways, can't be proven by evidence,
Yeah.
but we feel it and we can sense it and we know it. Even the fact that we're having this conversation, David, tells me that there is more to the human experience than just an amalgamation of atoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gives me to answer your question more pointedly, because I was kind of going off on a tangent there,
That's beautiful.
it gives me a path for my life and an understanding of the human experience that I don't see outside of myself.
Hmm. That that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Michael. Like, I honestly, when we're for a perfect way to conclude a discussion on the tribe drive and our tribal future, I think you just summed up the really the wellness enhancing benefits of what it means to belong to an identity.
Right.
You just like you almost answered a lot of the
Yeah.
questions you just posed me the past hour in a way. And it took me writing this book to really come full circle and to gain appreciation for the power of identity to provide meaning and purpose in people's lives, and that we have to be super careful as scientists, you know, before we go around trying to dismantle other people's identities,
Hmm.
in sort of a bad faith way.
Right, right.
We need to be very careful that you better have something better. You know what I mean? Like, you don't, it's so much easier to tear down than to build. So, like, make sure that whatever you are trying to do isn't just destructive, but it's constructive.
Yeah.
And so I've gained a full circle appreciation for my upbringing in the church. I noticed, the men and women who were in that church, they were t- they had they had meaning, they had
Yeah.
purpose, whereas to where I've seen a lot of people in the past 5 or 10 years without that substrate that didn't have that sense of status or value amongst their peers. And so there's something really powerful about it. And ultimately what you were getting at, that ultimate nod, was like, it provides meaning,
Yeah.
it's grafted meaning in my experience. And so it's a really profound thing. And I'm very mindful of the identities that I now do latch onto, to make sure that they can at least give me something on that end, on the dimension of meaning. Otherwise, they're probably not worthwhile.
You brought that back around really great to my first question, which is just taking note of tribalism's influence on yourself
Yeah,
and others. So that's a wonderful way to loop it right back around to the beginning, David.
beautiful.
Last question for you before I let you go, that I ask of all my guests, and I'm so curious to hear your answer on this. What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
Wow, that's great. A question that I wish I was asked more. Hmm, that's really good. Honestly, uh, what is the meaning of life?
Oh, you went there.
I
Okay.
did, and only because and this is actually not even from it's not from a scientific perspective or a pedagogical perspective. Uh, I did a 5 gram heroic dose of psilocybin with two of my best friends in the Chihuahuan desert, and I've got a really great. I've got an answer to that now. It's not the answer, but I've got an answer to it.
Bring it on.
That
Let's hear it.
only that um, the second law of thermodynamics is entropy, and we're surrounded by this entropic force, right? So, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life, I feel, is like anything that can fight this force, even if only briefly and temporarily. If it's about seeking that energy by which we can just for a moment fight a law of thermodynamics. And I think part of that puzzle is collaborating together as a species to be able to do it, to light a candle just long enough so that the universe can reflect back on itself.
Ooh,
Sorry,
boy.
man. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's
Oh
what
no, it
mushrooms does
does,
to
and
you
I
when you're in
love
the
it. So
desert.
I'm here for it.
Right on, man.
That is wonderful. David, thank you so much. I enjoyed the read. I enjoyed the book and a look at capitalizing on what makes bringing out the best of us. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation and for joining me. I appreciate you, sir.
Oh, it was an absolute pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for having me.
My friend, the goal here is not that you make every decision consciously with a conscious effort towards how your upbringing and your history and your tribe, the tribe that you identify with, how it has affected the decisions that you make. You can't make every decision consciously. It's not possible. You wouldn't get anything done because the amount of decisions that you make every day are innumerous and you would never be able to move. You would constantly be in decision making mode. So, yes, of course, your unique experiences and your unique view of the world and how you've gone about it, those make up a lot of subconscious decisions. But the key here is that you are more aware, that you take time to be aware of the ways that your reality has been shaped by your context as a human, where you grew up, what tribes have influenced you. And by tribes, I mean the people and places and spaces where you exist, where you feel like you belong, where you're a part of something bigger than just yourself. And whether you believe that you are one of one, and in many ways that you are, the fact is that there are many somethings most likely that you identify with, and those shape how you view the world. It shapes what you see as a problem, what you see as a solution. It shapes you politically, it shapes you behaviorally, it shapes you emotionally and spiritually. These all have an effect on you. And the more you can dig into what you truly believe, how you came to those beliefs, and why you have held on to those beliefs for as long as you have, the more you can, as you heard David say, just begin to get in this rhythm of paying attention, even though there are times when you will just subconsciously make a decision and go for it because that is what you have always done. That is what you have learned. That is your context. That is your bent towards reality, your reality. And this goes to the heart of my ask then see approach to conflict communication. And really, it goes to the beginning part, which is the ask part. Assume positive intent, set aside your ego, and know that you can't know everything. When you do those things, when that is your emotional posture, especially in times of conflict, look, we don't really have much of these issues when we're in times of harmony. But when we are met with something that flies directly in the face of what we believe, that's when the ask then see approach to conflict communication, as I write in my book, Can I Ask a Question? that's when it becomes powerful to help us bridge divides, to help us communicate across conflict and solve real issues. Assume positive intent of the other person, that they are making the best decision based on their experience and what they know to be true about how they've lived their life. Set aside your ego and your need for certainty, your need to be right, because honestly, who is right? And then know that you don't know everything. You simply can't. When you do that, you can go out and ask questions of yourself. You can go ask questions of others, and then you can go ask questions, you can go ask questions about others, and then you can ask questions of others. That is the ask then see approach. You can't make every decision consciously. We understand that. You understand that. But the more you lean into that reality, the more you can begin to broaden what it means, broaden what your reality means. I want to thank David for joining me here on the follow-up question. Please do me and David a huge favor and share this episode with your network and help us spread the good word about the value and the importance of asking more questions. Share this episode with someone you know. And if you like the guests and the conversations that I have on each and every episode, subscribe so that you never miss when a new episode drops. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. Don't forget, while you're there, sign up for my newsletter. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.